Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be taking part in this conference, one in a series that's gone on now for over 10 years of conferences on big history. I wish I could be in Col de Jocko, but I'm afraid that's just impossible. But I hope those of you there really enjoy this beautiful place. This is part of a panel in which big history scholars are talking about books they published recently. And I'll be talking about a book that's on the future and is called Future Stories. And its English subtitle is A User's Guide to the Future. And that really, I think, captures some of my motivations in writing the book. So what were those motivations? Why should a historian try to write about the future? Well, forgive me for sounding facetious, but a first motivation was simply a sense that as a big historian, I'd done the past. I'd tried to look at the whole of the past. So what was left? Well, the answer is the whole of the future. And that's not entirely facetious, because that really was one of my motivations in trying to write this book. I felt there was unfinished business here. But there were other motivations. I first began trying to think seriously about the future in response to a comment by a student in the early years of my teaching of big history. I think it was about the third or fourth year that I was teaching it. In our final lecture, we talked about today's world. And a very smart student came up to me afterwards and she said she'd really enjoyed the course, but she felt we'd left her on a cliff edge. She said, after talking about 13.8 billion years, you cannot simply stop on a dime. Now, you have to talk about where it's all going. And of course, I immediately thought she's absolutely right. And from then on, every course I taught in big history ended up with some thoughts about the future and some speculations about the future. And all my writing did the same thing. And there was another motivation, which was the feeling that my own lack of clarity about the future, and I really was struck by how confusing it was when you tried to think about the future, reflected partly the fact that educational institutions don't normally have courses on the future. We don't teach about the future in high schools. We don't teach about the future in most tertiary institutions, and so we teach a lot about the past, but not about the future. And yet the future is where we will spend the rest of our lives. And the future is what we spend a lot of our time thinking about. So I felt we really needed a sort of handbook on the future, what we mean by the future, how we prepare for the future, and so on. And in a sense, I was trying to write that handbook for myself. So I felt that the handbook needed to contain, well, I guess three main themes. First, a discussion of how scientists and philosophers have tried to think about and understand the future. Secondly, discussions about how in practice human beings, and in fact all living organisms, because all living organisms face the same challenge of preparing for a scarily uncertain future. How do they go about that practical challenge and get it right more than 50% of the time, which we do. And finally, I felt it would be cowardly not to attempt some scenarios about likely futures. So the book ends with 3 chapters looking at possible futures at different scales. Why the title, Future Stories? Well, I agonized for a long time over it, as I guess a lot of authors do, but one of the reasons was that I thought of this as a complement to big history. It rose out of my thinking on big history, and I thought of it as a complement to my previous book, Origin Story, which was a retelling of the big history story as I understood it. So I wanted the titles to balance each other. So Origin Story, Future Stories. Future Stories plural, because of course we always think of the future as multiple, whereas we think of the past as singular, even if the stories we tell about it are multiple. Why future stories? Well, there's another echo there. Future stories are what our heads are full of, and that was certainly one of my intentions in entitling this. We spend so much of our time thinking about possible futures, good futures, bad futures. How can we prepare for this? How can we avoid this? our heads are crammed with stories about possible futures. So I guess the questions running through the book are, how do we construct those stories? How reliable are they? How trustworthy are they? Can we put any trust in them at all? So future stories, our heads are full of future stories. Just look inside your head sometime and I think you'll see that. Now, main topics in the book. Well, these three main topics. What's the future? How in practice do we prepare for it? And what scenarios seem likely? So let me look at each of them in turn. First, what is the future? What do philosophers, and in fact theologians and scientists, have to tell us about what we mean by the future, what the future is? Does it exist? In what sense does it exist? Well, as soon as I started asking these questions, I found, as anyone else who asks these questions does, that you're in a sort of philosophical and scientific and even theological jungle, which is full of conundrums, puzzles, paradoxes. It's very strange territory. And there is no clear consensus about how we should understand the future. Let me just give you one example of the strange questions you find yourself asking very quickly. And it's one that St. Augustine asked. His Confessions have a wonderful section on time and the future. When we're in the present, we always have this feeling that there are multiple futures heading towards us. But where are those futures? I mean, in what sense do those futures actually exist? And in what sense does the past exist too? So Augustine said, do they exist in the sense that when the present emerges from the future, time comes out of some secret store and then recedes into some secret place where the past comes out of the present? This is all very weird. We imagine many futures, but we never experience more than one. Do any of those imagined futures really exist, those future stories? It's really hard to tell. If they don't exist, then that suggests the universe may be deterministic. There's only one story. So the whole project of thinking about the future is futile. Anyway, philosophically and scientifically, the future is very strange territory. So let's move on to the practical questions that we all have to face. We can't get a final answer from the scientists, but we have to deal with the future every second, every hour, every day of our lives. How do we do it? And how do other living organisms do it? We need practical rules of thumb. And all living organisms face that same challenge. And natural selection has built into all of them, including us, pretty powerful mechanisms for placing good bets on the future. This is a bit like betting on the horses. But someone who actually makes money from betting on the horses will do so because they've studied the past. And as we'll see, that's the basic principle in thinking about the future. So natural selection has built these skills into every living organism. And that's why the book has sections on how bacteria, how E. coli think about the future, as well as how humans do. There are some simple rules of thumb, and all of them are probabilistic. But there's one absolutely fundamental principle, and that is that we have no direct evidence from the future. The only guidance we can get about the future is paradoxically by looking at the past. There's a wonderful image in Dante's Inferno of soothsayers who are punished for their arrogance in trying to think about the future by having their heads twisted backwards so they could only look into the past. And in a sense, that's the situation we're all in. So how do you get guidance about the future from the past? Well, there's one fundamental principle here, is you look in the past for regular processes, because those are processes that you can have some confidence that they will repeat in the future, and they will give you some guidance as to what's going to happen in the past. The sun has risen in the morning every day of my life. I'm pretty confident it will rise tomorrow. So that is the fundamental principle. The past offers the only guidance we can have about the future. Now, I say this because we live in the 21st century in an era dominated by science. Earlier ages believed that maybe the spirits or the gods could offer guidance, but that's not the dominant modern view of the future. So all future thinking is based on this principle. And this principle explains a fundamental divide in modern scholarship between those disciplines that take future thinking seriously and those that don't. Historians, as you'll know, by and large, don't spend a lot of time thinking about the future. Collingwood, the historiographer, even argued that you shouldn't think about the future because if a historian starts trying to make predictions, you know something has gone seriously wrong with their ideas of history. Now, not all historians agree. E.H. Carr, for example, did believe that studying the past could provide some tentative guidance about the future. And that's no wonder. He was a Marxist, and of course, Marx himself believed that the past could provide some guidance about the future. Now, why this difference? Well, I think there's a very simple reason. Some domains of study are full of regular processes. So climate change scientists are very confident that increasing the proportion of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will raise global temperatures. Astronomers can predict with great confidence when the next lunar eclipse will happen. But historians, for example, deal with much less regular processes. They study the actions of individual human beings. And here we're in much messier, much swampier territory. So I think there's a good reason why historians are skeptical about the future. They deal with domains of reality in which there are fewer regular processes. Okay, let me end by talking about some scenarios for the future. As I said, I thought it would be cowardly not to do this. So the last 3 chapters of the book are about scenarios at different scales. And they are scenarios for humanity as a whole and for the cosmos as a whole. So these are very much in the spirit of big history. And I believe that big history has a huge contribution to make to thinking seriously about these sort of scenarios for the simple reason that if the past provides guidance on the present, then those historians who look at the past on the largest scales may see regularities that have persisted for long, long periods. And they ought to provide good guidance for thinking about the future. So big history, I think, is vital for serious future thinking. We need to study the long regularities that you see in big history. So let me give some examples here in the form of a number of broad speculations or about likely scenarios for the future. Here's the first. And this is maybe fairly unusual, but I believe that within the next century or two, it'll be possible to say that planet Earth has become conscious. And I increasingly think that this change may count as one of the great thresholds in big history. By saying planet Earth becomes conscious, I'm not talking mystically. What I mean is that it'll be conscious in the way that human beings are conscious. Most of the decisions taken by our bodies are not taken consciously. They're taken as a result of the many crisscrossing forces that are unconscious. But some of the big executive decisions, will I go bungee jumping tomorrow, are taken consciously. And that's the situation that Earth suddenly finds itself in. The future of planet Earth, perhaps for millions of years, will be shaped very much by conscious decisions of members of our species, because we now have become a planet-changing species. So planet Earth will become conscious. That's the first prediction. If we survive the next 100 years, and that we cannot guarantee. But if we do, it'll be because we've learned how to manage a planet. Second prediction, technological optimism. Our technological creativity, which is astonishing and exceptional, will continue into the future and may offer new tools for solving some of the problems we've created and for dealing with new problems that we face. We should expect technological creativity to continue for the very simple reason that this has been one of the dominant features of all of human history. In fact, our species is exceptional in its technological, scientific, ecological, and cultural creativity. That's why we dominate planet Earth at the moment. So here's a long trend. We should expect that creativity to continue, and I think that provides good justification for a certain degree of technological optimism. The third prediction, humans will migrate to other planetary systems and eventually, probably not before 1,000 or more years in the future, to other star systems. And again, this is based on a deep regularity in the past. Human beings have always been migratory, and they migrated because of their technological creativity, driven, as I've argued for many years, by collective learning, by our ability to share and accumulate information about our environment in a way that no other living organism can match in the history of planet Earth. So humans will migrate. And here's a fourth prediction. We will change what it means to be human. We will change our bodies. We'll change our minds. We will using drugs, using prosthetics, and eventually we will tweak our genes. We already have many of the technologies needed to do this. I wear hearing aids, and so I wear prosthetics already. So this is a prediction based on fairly recent trends, but one I think that we can make quite confidently. And what that means is that as humans spread throughout the solar system and eventually to nearby parts of the galaxy, we should expect humans to diversify, increasing number of diverse subspecies of humans to emerge. So our species will diversify as we spread through the galaxy. Cosmological futures, strangely, here we can make predictions with some confidence. At least cosmologists seem to believe that. And the reason is because the overall shape of the universe's history seems to be dominated by some fairly simple rules. The existence of the force of gravity, the fact that the universe is expanding faster and faster and faster. And what that means is that in the future, the universe will expand and thin out so that matter and energy will be spread over larger and larger areas, and that will make it more and more difficult to construct complex things. And that suggests that the universe will eventually start becoming simpler and simpler and simpler. And there will come a time when it cannot construct complex organisms like us. We may already have passed the era of peak star formation. Eventually, stars will start breaking down, atoms will start breaking down, and even black holes will start breaking down. So we can end with a thought that I've had before, which is that we happen to live at a time in the universe's history, in its youth, its early youth, when it had the energy to create complex things like you and me. We got lucky. Thank you very much.